Hello, I'm Andy Farrell. Today I'm going to speak with Clive Menzies of Critical Thinking. Clive, the Critical Thinking project began when?
January 2012 came out of the Occupy movement.
So what we're going to try and do today is to go through a diagram that you put up of the work of critical thinking over those 3.5 years. Starting at the top end of that, I see the word land.
Essentially what we've been trying to understand is how the world works. In other words, where does the power lie? Who wields it? Where does their power come from and how do they exercise it? And what do we do to change that to improve the way the world works? And land, if you like, is a fundamental right as a human being. To have the access to land is inherent just in being born. But the problem is we've had a system evolve over time where land is increasingly the preserve of the few, who either use it for their exclusive use or rent it out to other people at vast expense. And it's not just land, it's resources, and it's any other commons. In other words, things that are created in common, created by the community. So, for example, the radio spectrum or even knowledge. All of these things belong to us all, but have been appropriated by a relatively small number of people.
A branch coming off that is shared, not owned. Is this some form of critical thinking solution? Or
We've developed what we think are three principles to overcome what we think are three fundamental flaws. And this fundamental flaw of land basically derives from private ownership or any sort of ownership that restricts access to other people. And our contention is that the land, resources and commons are of value either because they're God-given or else they're created communally, and therefore their value should belong to no individual group or state, but should be shared for the benefit of all.
so, taking the next branch down, which is coming off at 3 o'clock, we've got this interest on money. There's quite a few branches coming off this. Would you like to say a bit about this?
Well, if land was the original flaw in many respects with the enclosures and people being turfed off the land, interest on money with the establishment of the banking system is another abusive and oppressive mechanism within our economic system, and it drives inequality. There's empirical evidence that it migrates wealth from those who have too little to those who have more than they need, and that in that process no actual wealth is created. Interest on money isn't wealth. Money is just a representation of wealth. And so this idea that interest on money is somehow wealth creating is completely nonsensical. There are no more widgets produced, or there's no more harvest produced. It's just an illusion of wealth that is created. But it's parasitic insofar as it's drawing up wealth from those who actually create it. So the 7 billion people on the planet are creating wealth, and that's being sucked up through the banking system to the very few. And interest is also discounting the future, so that a forest that is standing today is worth more cut down now than it is in the future, because money is deemed to have a value, and if you're not going to get it until some years in the future, then you discount its value that far ahead. The other thing that interest does is it creates an economic system, or we have an economic system that has to keep growing exponentially. People talk about GDP, or gross domestic product growth, of 3% per annum being a sort of reasonable rate of growth, but that means your economy has to double every 24 years. And that can't be sustainable mathematically, socially, or environmentally, because you're using more and more resources, and we live in a finite world.
Before we go on to discuss how that could be changed, you did use the word us there, and I was curious because this is a collective project. All of these diagrams and thought processes have come through a collective process, is that right?
Very much so. I mean, this is very much a distillation, not just of the work of the individuals directly involved with critical thinking, but we're drawing on ideas, thinking, knowledge that's been accumulated over millennia. One could arguably say that, and this comes back to the knowledge and the commons, that this information is contributed by anyone who's ever thought about or written anything or said anything about these issues. Their accumulated wisdom, hopefully, is synthesized within this diagram. And one cannot claim ownership to that. Critical thinking itself can't claim ownership to these ideas. What we've tried to do is bring the ideas together and the evidence together to show how the world works. And our analysis brings us to the point where we've created this diagram, if you like, and a theory of political economy.
So that collective synthesis there, just coming down to the branch at the bottom there, says the word abolition. This is the solution to this whole interest on money.
The thing about interest on money is that as soon as you charge interest on money, then basically you're saying that money has an inherent value of itself, which it doesn't. And in creating that inherent value, you create distortions in the economy, and you allow those who have money, or create it from nothing in the case of banks, to exploit those who need it. And therefore, debt needs to return to a social construct and move away from being what is effectively a financial lever of oppression and control.
So moving down to 6 o'clock, we've got this means to life, importantly. So again, starting with denied access.
Well, it's related very much to the top right-hand corner and the land and the commons and access to the means to life, because essentially access to land before the enclosures and before the privatisation of land meant that everybody had access to the means to life. You could build your own house, you could find your own food, you could grow your own food. But progressively, we've been denied access to the land. And one saw it through the enclosures and the Industrial Revolution, that people were effectively forced into slavery through the Industrial Revolution. So they could no longer live off the land, so they were forced into factories. And there's a lot more that goes behind that in terms of the social impact. And over time, the workers collected together in unions and fought for better wages and conditions, but we reached a point not very long ago where productivity and wages started to diverge. So productivity has continued to increase, so we now produce more than we need with fewer and fewer people, and yet wages haven't kept pace, and so that gap has been filled by debt. And as we saw in 2008, that debt is not sustainable. And more importantly, from a sort of demographical point of view, there just aren't going to be the jobs to do. There was a video recently that's going around the internet called "Humans Need Not Apply," and so many jobs, white-collar jobs, even journalists, lawyers, all those people who think they're going to be untouched by this march of robotics and artificial intelligence, they're all going to be at risk of losing their jobs. So we're creating what David Graeber describes as bullshit jobs that have no value or even destructive, merely as part of this economic mechanism to find a means of making the thing work. But we should be giving the money direct to the people rather than creating this artificial system of work, which is increasingly obsolete.
Could you see ways in which the constitutionalists are addressing these?
Well, this is a dialogue, and we've critical thinking works with many groups. We work with the constitutionalists, and we work with many other groups. And more people are beginning to recognise that our political systems are incapable of implementing the principles that we've laid out of sharing the value of the land and the commons, prohibiting or abolishing interest on money, and paying everyone an unconditional citizen's dividend. We don't have the political systems that either have the will or the ability to implement it. They're basically owned by the same people that own all the other levers of power. So we need constitutional change. And what we're working on currently within critical thinking is the whole issue of hierarchy and how this structure, this institutional hierarchy emerged, because, and this is not for this conversation, because what we need to look at is how do we dissolve this institutional hierarchy in order to ensure that concentration of power will never again allow a small minority to extract all the wealth and oppress everybody else.
I suppose that's a good place to leave this podcast, which is opening out another fascinating conversation to come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.